The girl stood at the edge of town with nothing but a wool blanket, a small canvas sack of cornmeal, and the clothes on her back. September 29th, 1886. The aspens had just begun to turn gold on the ridges above Coldwater, Wyoming, their leaves trembling in a wind that carried the first whisper of something the townspeople refused to hear. Sarah Blackwood was 11 years old, small for her age, with dark braided hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes that had seen things no child should see. Behind her, the people of Coldwater watched from their doorways and windows, their faces hard, with the particular cruelty that fear wears when it pretends to be righteousness. No one waved. No one called out a kindness. Reverend Josiah Whitmore had pronounced her a liar and a disturber of the peace, and the town had agreed that she must go. Her crime was simple. She had told them the truth. 3 days prior, she had stood in the general store, her voice carrying the strange certainty that had always unnerved the adults around her. The words had come out clear and unwavering. The winter is coming early. It will be the worst winter anyone has ever seen. The snow will bury the houses. The cold will kill the cattle. You must prepare now or many will die. The storekeeper had laughed a nervous sound that didn't reach his eyes. The women had whispered behind their hands, glancing at Sarah with a mixture of pity and suspicion. And Reverend Whitmore, who considered himself the moral authority of Coldwater, had declared that the child was either possessed by demons or simply wicked, spreading fear for the devil's amusement. From his pulpit that Sunday, his voice had thundered across the assembled congregation. No child could know such things. This is the work of darkness. The girl must be cast out before her corruption spreads. And so they had cast her out, with 6 weeks of autumn still ahead and the high country glowing with the last warmth of September. They had sent an 11-year-old girl into the wilderness with nothing but a blanket and a handful of cornmeal. Sarah did not look back as she walked away. Looking back was for people who had something to return to. She had never had much of anything. Her mother had died birthing her, and her father, a trapper named Caleb Blackwood, who spent more time in the mountains than in any town, had raised her in the wild places where the Wind River Range met the sky. The memories of those years lived in her body like muscle memory. Her father had taught her to read the land the way other children learn to read books. She could understand the animals, see the signs that nature provided for those patient enough to observe. He had shown her how the thickness of a caterpillar's coat predicted winter's severity, how the height of beaver dams indicated coming snow depth, how the behavior of elk and deer revealed what the cold months would bring. Caleb had died when Sarah was 9, taken by a grizzly in a canyon above the Sweetwater River. She had found his body 3 days later, following the ravens that circled and called in the particular way that meant death. The grave she dug with his own hunting knife had taken her 2 full days, the rocky soil resisting every scrape of the blade. She had buried him deep enough that the scavengers wouldn't find him, then marked the spot with a cairn of stones that she built as high as her chest. Then she had walked to Coldwater, the nearest settlement, hoping to find some kind of life among people. The town had not known what to make of her. A wild child who appeared from the mountains, who spoke of her dead father, without tears, who knew things about weather and animals that no child should know. She was unsettling in ways the townspeople could not articulate. They had taken her in reluctantly, passing her from household to household, no family willing to keep her for long. She worked for her keep, scrubbing floors until her knees ached, mending clothes by candlelight, tending livestock in weather that made grown men curse. But she never fit, never softened, never became the grateful orphan they expected her to be. What she became instead was a prophet they refused to hear. In the spring of 1885, she had warned them about the flash flood. The signs had been obvious to anyone who knew how to look the snowpack in the high country. Unusually heavy, the creek running brown with silt. Weeks before it should, the behavior of the muskrats along the banks, suggesting they sensed rising water. She had told the Hendersons, the family she was staying with at the time, that Willow Creek would jump its banks within 3 days. They had ignored her. A child's imagination, they said. Fanciful thinking from a girl who spent too much time alone. 3 horses had drowned when the flood came exactly as she predicted. The Mercer Ranch lost a section of fence and 200 yards of irrigated pasture. The Hendersons moved Sarah to a different family the following week, as if the flood had been her fault. In August of that same year, she had told them about the early frost. The woolly bear caterpillars she found near the creek had been darker than usual, their black bands wider than the brown. The aspen leaves had begun to curl at the edges weeks ahead of schedule. The deer were moving to lower elevations with an urgency that spoke of instinct older than human memory. She had warned the Harrigans, her current hosts, that a killing frost would come before the month ended. Plant your vegetables now or lose them, she had said. Cover what you can't harvest. They had dismissed her, a child who could not possibly understand the growing season better than farmers who had worked this land for 20 years. The frost came on August 28th, in sudden blackening every garden in the valley. The Harrigans lost their entire vegetable crop. They blamed Sarah for bringing bad luck and sent her to live with the widow Patterson. Each time she spoke, they found reasons not to listen. She was strange. She was fanciful. She was a child who could not possibly understand the things she claimed to understand. The fact that she was always right only made them more determined to prove her wrong. By September of 1886, when she warned them about the winter, they had heard enough. But Sarah had not lied. She had observed. In August, she had noticed the beaver dams on the upper creek built higher than any she had ever seen. The animals worked with a desperate urgency that spoke of deep instinct, adding layer after layer of branches and mud until the structures stood nearly 6 feet tall. Her father had taught her that beavers knew. They always knew. In early September, she had seen the elk moving down from the high country a full month early. Their coats were already thick, their behavior nervous and watchful. They grazed in tight groups and startled at sounds that should not have alarmed them. The does kept their calves close in a way that suggested they sensed danger coming. The woolly bear caterpillars were almost entirely black. Sarah had found dozens of them crossing the trail near Patterson's cabin, and every single one showed the same pattern, thick black bands with only the thinnest stripe of brown. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Black caterpillars mean deep, cold, Sarah girl. The darker they are, the harder the winter. The squirrels were gathering with a frenzy that bordered on madness. She watched them from the widow's porch, rushing from tree to tree, their cheeks bulging with nuts and seeds. They cached food in dozens of locations, far more than a normal autumn required. They knew something the humans did not. Her father had taught her to read these signs. He had taught her that the animals always knew, and the animals were saying that death was coming. Now walking away from the town that had rejected her, Sarah did not waste energy on anger or grief. She had learned young that such emotions were luxuries the wilderness did not allow. Instead, she turned her mind to the only question that mattered: how to survive. She walked north toward the foothills, where her father had sometimes taken her, where the sandstone cliffs rose from the sagebrush flats and the rock was soft enough to carve but hard enough to last. The knife at her belt was the same blade that had dug her father's grave, its edge worn but still keen. The cornmeal in her sack would last perhaps a week if she was careful. The blanket would provide warmth as long as she could find shelter from the wind. The first day took her through country she knew. Rolling grassland dotted with sage, cut by dry washes that would run wild with snowmelt come spring. She saw the tracks of antelope and the scratchings of sage grouse. A golden eagle circled overhead riding thermals that rose from the warming earth. By nightfall, she had covered perhaps 15 miles, her legs aching, but her resolve intact. She slept that night in the shelter of a fallen cottonwood, the massive trunk providing a windbreak against the cooling air. She allowed herself a small handful of cornmeal mixed with water from a seep spring, forcing herself to chew slowly and make it last. The stars overhead were sharp and clear, the Milky Way, a river of light that her father had taught her to navigate by. She found the North Star and oriented herself, then wrapped the wool blanket tight and closed her eyes. The second day brought her into rougher country. The grassland gave way to broken terrain, where sandstone outcrops thrust up through the soil like bones through skin. Juniper and pinyon pine appeared twisted by wind into shapes that seemed to reach for something just beyond their grasp. The air smelled of resin and dust and the distant promise of snow. By mid-afternoon, she found what she was looking for. The cliff face rose 40 feet above a small valley where a spring emerged from the rocks, its water clear and cold, and tasting of minerals. The stone was red gold sandstone, layered and fractured by millennia of freezing and thawing. More importantly, there was a crack in the rock, a natural fissure that ran back into the cliff face wide enough for her small body to squeeze through. She approached carefully, watching for signs of recent animal use. Mountain lions sometimes denned in such places. Bears used them for winter sleep. But the sand at the entrance showed only the tracks of pack rats and the delicate prints of deer mice. The opening itself was perhaps 18 inches wide, a vertical split in the stone that seemed to breathe cool air from some hidden cavity within. Sarah removed her blanket and sack, set them aside, and squeezed through the gap. Darkness swallowed her immediately. She stood still, letting her eyes adjust, her breathing loud in the confined space. Gradually, shapes emerged from the black. The fissure opened into a cavity, perhaps 10 feet deep and 8 feet wide, with a ceiling that rose to maybe 6 feet at its highest point. Light filtered in through the entrance crack, just enough to see by once her pupils had dilated fully. The floor was sandy, dry, relatively level. The walls showed signs of water seepage from some ancient time, leaving behind ripples and channels in the stone. But currently the space was bone dry, the air cool but not damp. It was not a home, not yet, but it could become one. Sarah returned to the entrance, retrieved her belongings, and brought them inside. She sat in the dimness and considered what needed to happen next. The cavity was too small. The entrance was too narrow. There was no ventilation for a fire. The space required expansion, shaping transformation from raw stone into livable shelter. She had her father's knife. She had knowledge. She had time if she could stay ahead of the winter that was coming. She began to carve. The sandstone yielded to the blade more easily than she had hoped. The first cuts were exploratory, testing the stone's hardness and grain. She found that by angling the knife and using a scraping motion, she could remove thin layers of rock without dulling the edge too quickly. It was slow work measured in fractions of inches per hour, but it was possible. The first week was the hardest. Her hands blistered within hours, the soft skin of her palms tearing against the knife's handle. She wrapped them in strips torn from the hem of her dress, but the fabric quickly became stiff with blood and had to be changed. By the third day, her palms had bled so much that she could barely grip the knife. She forced herself to continue anyway, scraping and chopping until her arms trembled with exhaustion. On the fourth day, the blisters burst and began to harden into calluses. The pain shifted from sharp to dull, from unbearable to merely constant. She learned to work through it, to find a rhythm that allowed her to carve for hours without stopping. By the end of the first week, her hands had transformed into something closer to leather than skin, rough and scarred, but functional. She widened the entrance, first scraping away at the crack until it opened to nearly 3 feet across. The work generated piles of stone dust and small fragments that she carried outside and scattered away from the entrance. She did not want the debris to announce her presence to anyone who might pass. Next, she deepened the interior, working from the back wall forward, removing stone layer by patient layer. The cavity slowly expanded, gaining inches and then feet of additional depth. She carved the walls smooth where she could, creating flat surfaces that would reflect what little light entered the space. The ceiling she left mostly natural, following the existing contours of the stone except where she needed additional headroom. She gathered materials as she found them. Deadfall branches from the valley floor became fuel for the fire she would eventually need. She sorted them by size and type, stacking them in a dry wash where they would be protected from rain. Dry grass from the hillsides became potential bedding. She collected it in armfuls, carrying it back to a spot near the spring where it could cure fully before she brought it inside. Flat stones from the creek bed became tools. She discovered that certain types of sandstone, when struck against each other, would flake into sharp edges suitable for scraping. These crude chisels allowed her to work faster than the knife alone permitted, removing larger sections of stone from areas where precision was less critical. She kept the knife for detail work and the stone tools for rough excavation. She foraged as her father had taught her. Pine nuts from the piñon trees that dotted the hillsides, each one requiring careful extraction from its cone, but worth the effort for the oil and protein it contained. Rose hips from the wild rose bushes along the creek, their bright red fruits tart and rich with nutrients that would prevent scurvy through the long winter. Roots of various plants that could be roasted in coals until they became palatable, biscuit root yampa spring beautycorns that she dug with a sharpened stick. She set snares for rabbits using techniques her father had shown her when she was barely old enough to walk. A simple loop of braided grass positioned along a game trail anchored to a bent sapling that would spring up when triggered. She checked them morning and evening, resetting those that had been sprung by the wind or tripped by animals too small to hold. The first rabbit came on the 9th day, a cottontail young and tender caught cleanly around the neck. Sarah dispatched it quickly with a sharp blow behind the ears, the way her father had taught her. Waste nothing, he had said. Respect what gives itself so you may live. She skinned it, carefully preserving the hide. The meat she roasted over a small fire built in a shallow pit outside the cave, eating slowly and saving half for the following day. The pelt she scraped clean of fat and flesh, then stretched on a frame of willow branches to cure. It was small, but it was a start. 10 rabbit skins properly prepared and stitched together would make a vest. 20 would make a coat. By October, the cavity had become a room, 12 feet deep, 10 feet wide, 7 feet tall at the peak. The walls were smooth where she had carved them, the floor level and swept clean. The entrance had been widened to 4 feet, large enough to move through comfortably, but still small enough to defend if necessary. She had carved a fire pit near the entrance, sinking it 18 inches into the stone floor and positioning it beneath a natural crack in the ceiling that would serve as a chimney. The first time she lit a fire inside the cave, she held her breath, watching to see if the smoke would draw properly or if she would be forced to extinguish it and try again elsewhere. The smoke rose straight up through the crack, pulled by the natural draft created by the temperature difference between inside and outside. Within minutes, the space began to warm the stone walls, absorbing heat and radiating it back into the room. The fire pit worked perfectly, better than she had dared hope. She began to accumulate supplies. Each rabbit she caught added to her store of meat and fur. She learned to smoke the meat over low fires, suspending the strips on racks made from willow branches, letting the smoke preserve what fresh air would rot. The smoked rabbit tasted of juniper and sage depending on what wood she burned, and would last for months if kept dry. A small alcove in the bushy wall became her storage area. Dried rabbit meat in one corner, wrapped in grass to keep it clean. Foraged nuts and roots in another, sorted by type, and arranged so she could rotate through them and use the oldest first. Bundles of firewood stacked tight against the wall, enough for perhaps 3 weeks of constant burning if the winter came as hard as she knew it would. But she needed more. More meat, more fuel, more insulation against the cold that was coming. The rabbits alone would not sustain her through a winter that might last 5 months or more. She needed larger game. The deer came to the spring in the early morning and late evening. She had been watching them for weeks, learning their patterns, noting which trails they favored and where they stopped to browse. Mule deer mostly does, and fawns with an occasional young buck whose antlers had not yet grown to full size. They were wary, but not overly cautious, accustomed to this isolated valley where few predators hunted and fewer humans came. Sarah had no bow. She had no rifle. What she had was patience and her father's knife and the knowledge of how to use terrain to her advantage. She chose a spot along the deer trail where the animals had to pass through a narrow gap between 2 boulders. She positioned herself downwind, crouched behind a juniper bush, and waited. The doe came at dusk on the 3rd day of her vigil, a young animal, perhaps 2 years old, moving cautiously down the trail with her ears swiveling to catch any sound of danger. Sarah remained absolutely still, her breathing slow and shallow, her body positioned so that no human silhouette would catch the deer's eye. The doe passed within 6 feet of her hiding spot. Sarah moved in a single fluid motion, launching herself from cover with the knife gripped in both hands. The blade found the deer's throat before the animal could react, severing the major vessels in a cut her father had taught her to make. The doe took 3 staggering steps and collapsed, her life bleeding out onto the sandy soil. Sarah knelt beside the dying animal and placed one hand on its flank. Her father had taught her this too. Bear witness to what you take. Let the animal know it is not alone. When the doe's breathing stopped, Sarah began the work of field dressing. She opened the body cavity, carefully removing the organs and setting aside the heart and liver for immediate eating. The rest she would bury away from her cave, returning nutrients to the soil. The meat she quartered, working quickly as the light faded, her hands slick with blood, but her cuts precise. She could not carry all of it at once. She made 3 trips from the kill site to her cave, hauling the quarters one at a time, then returning for the hide. By the time she finished, full darkness had fallen and her arms shook with exhaustion. But she had meat, real meat, enough protein to sustain her for weeks if she was careful. She spent the next day processing the deer. The meat she cut into strips for smoking, suspending them over a low fire that she kept burning continuously for 3 days. The hide she scraped clean, working the flesh side with a stone scraper until no fat or tissue remained. Then she began the laborious process of brain tanning, using the deer's own brain to soften the leather. Her father had shown her this when she was 8, explaining that every animal carried exactly enough brains to tan its own hide. The work was messy and time-consuming, but the result was worth it. Soft buckskin that would provide warmth without the stiffness of untreated leather. She could make moccasins from it, or a shirt, or simply use it as an additional blanket when the deep cold came. November arrived with a clarity that made Sarah's skin prickle. The sky was too blue, the air too still. The aspens on the distant ridges had already lost their leaves, standing bare and pale against the dark green of the pines. The deer had moved to lower elevations, clustering in sheltered valleys where browse was still available. The few birds that remained were species that could endure winter: ravens, magpies, jays that cached food and grew thick plumage against the coming cold. Sarah worked with increased urgency. She expanded the cave further, carving out a second chamber that would serve as a stable. The idea had come to her, gradually born from the realization that she needed more than just food and shelter. She needed warmth beyond what a fire could provide, and she needed mobility in case she had to travel for supplies. She needed a horse. The wild mustangs that roamed the foothills were descendants of Spanish stock, tough and resourceful animals that had adapted to the harsh conditions of the high plains. They moved in small bands, grazing the bunch grass and sage, ranging over territories that could span dozens of miles. Sarah had seen their tracks near the spring, the distinctive marks of unshod hooves in the sand. She built a trap using knowledge her father had shared during the long winter evenings when he told stories of the old mountain men. A small corral constructed from aspen poles lashed together with strips of rawhide positioned near the spring where the horses came to drink. An opening just wide enough for one horse, leading to a narrow chute that would funnel the animal into the enclosure. A trip line made from braided grass that would release a gate when disturbed. It took her 4 days to build. On the 5th day, she baited it with a pile of sweet grass she had harvested and dried. Then she retreated to a vantage point on the cliff above and waited. The horses came on the 7th day. A band of 6 led by a dun-colored mare whose watchful eyes and alert posture marked her as the leader. Sarah watched them approach the spring, noted how the mare tested the air, how the other horses deferred to her judgment. These were animals that had survived predators and weather and the constant challenges of their environment. They would not be easily fooled. The mare circled the trap twice, snorting and stamping. She could smell the human scent despite Sarah's efforts to mask it. The other horses hung back, waiting for her decision. For long minutes it seemed the plan would fail, that the mare's caution would keep the band away from the trap entirely. Then a younger horse, a dun mare not yet fully grown, made a decision of her own. She broke from the group and trotted toward the opening, drawn by the smell of the sweet grass. The led mare called out a warning, but the younger horse ignored it, pushing her head through the entrance to reach the bait. The trip line caught on her chest. The gate swung down, sealing the entrance. The young mare exploded into panicked motion, wheeling and bucking in the confined space, calling out in distress to the band that was already scattering into the distance. Sarah descended from her perch and approached the corral, slowly speaking in a low voice that her father had used with skittish animals. The mare wheeled to face her, eyes rolling, white nostrils flared. She was perhaps 3 years old, small, even for a Mustang, with a coat the color of dark honey and eyes that caught the light like amber. Over the next week, Sarah worked to gentle the horse. She moved slowly, never making sudden movements, speaking constantly in that low voice that carried no threat. She brought water in a hide bucket, placing it just inside the corral and retreating. She brought grass, fresh cut and fragrant. She spent hours simply sitting near the fence, allowing the mare to grow accustomed to her presence. On the 8th day, the mare allowed her to touch her shoulder. On the 10th day, she accepted a rope halter made from braided rawhide. By the end of 2 weeks, Sarah could lead her from the corral to the cave entrance and back again, the horse following with only occasional resistance. She named her Whisper for the soft sounds the horse made when Sarah approached, a gentle nickering that seemed to express curiosity rather than fear. The second chamber Sarah had carved became Whisper's stable. It was smaller than the main room, perhaps 8 feet by 6, with a ceiling high enough that the horse could stand comfortably. Sarah lined the floor with sand and dry grass, creating a bed that would absorb waste and provide insulation from the cold stone. She carved a small trough into one wall for water and fashioned a manger from bent willow branches for hay. Whisper's presence transformed the cave. The heat from her body radiated through both chambers, raising the temperature noticeably. Her quiet breathing and occasional movements created sounds that made the space feel less empty. And her companionship, unexpected and unlooked for, filled something in Sarah that she had not realized was hollow. By mid-November, Sarah had also completed the door. She had dragged aspen logs from a grove 2 miles away, trimming them to size and lashing them together with strips of rawhide. The resulting structure was crude but functional, a barrier of wood perhaps 3 inches thick that fit into a frame she had carved into the stone entrance. The frame itself had taken days to create, each cut measured and checked to ensure a tight seal. She carved channels along the top and sides where the door would sit, designing them so that the door could be wedged in place from inside, creating an insulated barrier against wind and snow. The first time she fitted the door into place and secured it, the difference was immediate. The temperature inside rose by several degrees. The constant whisper of wind through the entrance ceased. The flickering of her fire steadied as the drafts disappeared. Behind the door, with Whisper in the adjoining chamber and a fire burning in the pit, the cave became genuinely warm. She had created shelter. Real shelter, not just a hole in the ground, but a space designed for survival, equipped with everything she would need to endure what was coming. The first snow fell on November 12th, 6 weeks earlier than usual. Sarah woke to a different quality of silence, the particular quiet that comes when snow begins to muffle the world. She opened the door to find fat flakes falling straight down through still air, accumulating quickly on the ground that had been bare and brown the night before. She stood in the entrance and watched the snow transform the landscape. Within an hour, the sagebrush had vanished beneath a white blanket. Within 2 hours, the snow stood ankle deep and showed no sign of stopping. The animal she had observed in August had been right. The worst was coming. Sarah closed the door and wedged it tight. Inside, the fire burned steadily. Whisper shifted in her stall, making the soft sounds that gave her name. The smoked meat hung from racks along the wall. The firewood stood stacked and ready. The water skin was fulfilled from the spring before the snow began. She was as prepared as an 11-year-old girl could be, alone in the wilderness, facing a winter that would become legend. 20 miles to the south, in the town of Coldwater, the first snow fell on houses whose root cellars were not yet full-on ranches, whose herds grazed in the open on a general store, whose shelves held what had seemed like adequate supplies, but would prove tragically insufficient. In his church, Reverend Josiah Whitmore looked out at the falling snow and felt the first cold touch of doubt. The girl had said 6 weeks early she had said the worst winter anyone had seen. He pushed the thought away and turned back to his sermon notes, convincing himself that coincidence was not prophecy, that a child could not possibly have known what trained observers had missed. In the Mercer Ranch house, Thomas Mercer stood at the window and watched the snow pile against the fences. He was 14 years old, old enough to remember the girl who had lived briefly with his family the previous winter, old enough to recall her warning about the frost that had destroyed his mother's garden, old enough to feel the first stirrings of fear that perhaps they should have listened. The snow fell for 3 days without stopping. When it finally ended, the world had changed. The landscape Sarah knew had vanished beneath 8 feet of white. The temperature dropped to levels that made exposed skin freeze in minutes. The wind began to blow, and it would not stop blowing for months. Winter had arrived. The winter Sarah had warned them about. The winter they had called her a liar for predicting. And in her cave carved from living stone with her horse and her fire and her hard-won supplies, Sarah Blackwood settled in to survive what the people of Coldwater were only beginning to understand they might not. The blizzard came with a violence that seemed personal. Wind screamed down from the peaks at speeds that bent the juniper trees nearly horizontal. Snow drove sideways through the air, not falling but flying each flake a tiny blade of ice that scoured anything exposed. The temperature plunged to 40 below zero and stayed there, a cold so profound that it turned breath to ice crystals before they could leave the lungs. Inside her carved stone sanctuary, Sarah woke to darkness and the sound of wind trying to tear the world apart. The door she had built shuddered in its frame, the wooden planks groaning under the pressure. She rose quickly, checking the wedges that held it in place, adding more stones to brace the bottom edge, where the force seemed strongest. The fire had burned down to coals during the night. She fed it carefully, nursing the embers back to flame with twists of dry grass and small sticks. Whispers shifted nervously in the adjoining chamber, disturbed by the storm's fury. Sarah moved to her, placing a hand on the mare's warm shoulder, speaking quietly until the horse settled. The animal's heat filled the small space, radiating through the opening between the chambers. Without Whisper, the cave would have been merely survivable. With her, it approached comfortable. The storm lasted 4 days. Sarah measured time by the progression of meals and the intervals between feeding the fire. She rationed her wood carefully, burning only what was necessary to maintain warmth and cook her food. The smoked rabbit and deer meat sustained her, supplemented by pine nuts she roasted in the coals. She melted snow for water, pushing open the door just wide enough to fill a hide bucket, then sealing it again against the cold that tried to rush inside. On the 4th day, the wind finally died. Sarah opened the door to a world transformed beyond recognition. The snow had drifted against the cliff face in waves and ridges that towered over her head. The valley floor had disappeared entirely beneath a white expanse broken only by the dark shapes of taller sagebrush pushing through. The sky was a pale, merciless blue, the kind of blue that promised no warmth despite the brightness. She ventured out slowly, testing each step before committing her weight. The snow's surface had crusted over from the wind and cold, creating a layer that sometimes held her weight and sometimes broke through, plunging her thigh-deep into the powder beneath. Moving even short distances required exhausting effort. The spring still flowed, though. Ice had formed around its edges, and long icicles hung from the rocks where water seeped. Sarah broke through the ice to fill her water skins, working quickly before her hands went numb, despite the deer hide mittens she had fashioned. The cold bit through every layer of clothing, finding gaps and seams with predatory efficiency. She checked her snares, though she held little hope of finding anything. The rabbits had gone to ground, burrowed deep beneath the snow, where they would wait out the worst of the winter in a torpor that slowed their metabolism to near hibernation. The deer had moved to lower elevations, seeking any browse they could find in sheltered valleys, where the wind had stripped some slopes bare. But one snare positioned in thick brush near the cliff base held a grouse. The bird had frozen solid, its feathers roughed out against the cold, its eyes glazed with ice. Sarah retrieved it carefully, resetting the snare with fingers that had lost most of their feeling. The grouse was small, but it represented protein and fat that would supplement her stores. Nothing could be wasted. She spent the afternoon processing the bird working inside where her hands could function. The feathers she saved for insulation, stuffing them into a pouch she had sewn from rabbit hide. The meat she roasted immediately, the smell making her mouth water, even though she had eaten that morning. The bones she would boil for broth, extracting every bit of nutrition they contained. As the short winter day faded to darkness, Sarah stood at her doorway and looked south toward where Coldwater lay. 20 miles of wilderness separated her from the town, but she could imagine what was happening there. The cattle would be dying. The horses would be foundering in snow too deep for them to paw through to reach grass. The people would be burning furniture to stay warm as their woodpiles dwindled faster than expected. She wondered if they remembered her warning. She wondered if Reverend Whitmore stood in his church and prayed for deliverance from the very disaster he had refused to prepare for. She wondered if Thomas Mercer, who had always watched her with something that might have been sympathy, was still alive. Then she closed the door and put Coldwater out of her mind. The wilderness did not care about irony or vindication. It only cared about who was prepared and who was not. December brought storm after storm, each one building on the last, adding layers to snow that already measured in feet rather than inches. Between the storms came periods of brutal clarity when the temperature dropped so low that the snow squeaked underfoot and Sarah's breath froze in her hair. The sun rose late and set early, its pale light offering no warmth, only the mockery of illumination. Sarah established a routine that kept her alive and relatively sane. Each morning she fed the fire-fed Whisper and checked her supplies. Each afternoon she ventured out if the weather allowed, checking snares, gathering what little she could find, breaking ice at the spring. Each evening she tended her equipment, sewing or repairing, maintaining the tools and clothing that stood between her and death. The cave itself required constant attention. Ice formed around the doorframe where moisture from cooking and breathing met the outside cold. She chipped it away regularly to prevent the door from freezing shut. The chimney crack sometimes became blocked with snow, forcing her to extinguish the fire until she could clear it. The floor accumulated moisture from tracked-in snow and condensation requiring frequent sweeping and the addition of fresh sand. Whisper needed daily care. Sarah let her out when possible, letting the horse move and stretch muscles that would cramp from confinement. She brushed the mare's coat, removing the dust and dead hair that accumulated. She picked her hooves, checking for ice balls that could cause lameness. And she rationed the grass she had stored, knowing that it had to last until spring growth began in April or May. The horse became more than transportation or warmth. In the isolation of the cave, with weeks passing without human contact, Whisper became Sarah's anchor to sanity. She talked to the mare constantly, explaining her plans, describing her memories, simply filling the silence with words that kept her own mind from turning inward. The horse's presence demanded routine and purpose, forcing Sarah to maintain disciplines that might otherwise have slipped. On Christmas Day, though, Sarah had it no calendar and marked it only by her best estimate of time's passage, she allowed herself a small celebration. She cooked a piece of deer meat seasoned with wild herbs she had dried in autumn. She fed Whisper an extra portion of the dwindling grass. She sat by the fire and sang songs her father had taught her, ballads of the old country and trail songs of the mountain men, her voice echoing off stone walls that had never heard music before. The next day brought another blizzard that lasted a week. January descended with a cold that redefined what Sarah thought possible. The temperature dropped to 50 below zero, perhaps lower. She had no thermometer, but she knew that at such temperatures, exposed skin froze in less than a minute. Breath emerged as ice crystals that fell to the ground with a sound like breaking glass. Metal became dangerous to touch, even through mittens, conducting cold so efficiently that it burned like fire. The world outside contracted to what could be seen from the cave entrance during the brief periods when the storms paused. Everything beyond 100 yards disappeared into a white void where earth and sky merged into a single colorless nothing. The wind carved the snow into fantastic shapes, creating dunes and ridges and caves that changed with each storm, transforming the landscape into something alien and hostile. Sarah's supplies began to show the strain. The smoked meat that had seemed abundant in November had diminished to perhaps 3 weeks' worth if she rationed carefully. The firewood she had stacked with such satisfaction was half gone, and the calculation of how much remained versus how many weeks of winter still threatened brought cold sweat despite the frigid air. The grass for Whisper would last perhaps another month, maybe 6 weeks if she fed the horse at the minimum level needed to sustain life. She increased her foraging efforts despite the danger and difficulty. On days when the storms eased, she ventured farther from the cave, searching for anything that could extend her supplies. She found a stand of choke cherry bushes whose dried fruit still clung to the branches, shriveled and bitter but edible. She dug through the snow to harvest cattail roots from a frozen marsh breaking through ice and mud to reach the starchy rhizomes. One afternoon, following a line of tracks through the snow, she discovered the carcass of a mule deer. The animal had died recently, perhaps the previous night, and its body still relatively fresh despite the cold. Something had killed it, Mountain Lion, most likely judging by the claw marks on the haunches. But the predator had eaten its fill and moved on, leaving meat that Sarah desperately needed. She worked quickly, cutting away the portions the lion had not touched, loading them onto a makeshift sled she dragged back to the cave. The meat was frozen solid, which meant it would keep indefinitely in the natural freezer of the winter landscape. She cached most of it in a drift near her entrance, covering it with snow and marking the spot with a pile of stones. The rest she brought inside to thaw and cook. That night, she fed Whisper extra grain she had been hoarding, and she ate deer steak until her stomach ached from fullness. The windfall had bought her time, perhaps enough to reach spring. But in cold water, no such luck came to ease the suffering. The first death occurred on December 31st, though Sarah would not learn this until much later. Ezekiel Harrigan, patriarch of the ranching family, whose gardens Sarah had warned about the previous August, died in his bed, surrounded by children and grandchildren who were powerless to save him. He was 73 years old, a man who had survived 50 Wyoming winters, but this one had demands his failing body could not meet. He died of cold and hunger, in the despair of watching everything he had built over 5 decades disappear beneath snow that would not stop falling. His last words whispered to his son Marcus were a question. Was the girl right? Marcus Harrigan had no answer. He buried his father in snow behind the house, unable to dig through frozen ground, and returned inside to face his own family's dwindling supplies. By mid-January, Coldwater's general store stood empty. The shelves that had held sacks of flour and beans now held nothing but dust. The barrels of salted pork had been scraped clean weeks earlier. The coffee and sugar and tea had disappeared before Christmas. The store owner, a man named Peterson, who had laughed when Sarah warned about the winter, rationed his own family's food by counting out individual beans. The hunters who ventured out in search of game returned with nothing. The deer and elk had abandoned their usual ranges, driven by desperation to areas the hunters could not reach through snow that stood chest-deep on a tall man. The few rabbits they managed to snare provided barely enough meat for a single meal per family. The grouse and ptarmigan had vanished entirely, flocked together in dense timber where the hunters could not follow. Families began to sicken. Without adequate nutrition, their bodies could not generate the heat needed to fight off the cold. Without heat, they burned furniture, then fence posts, then anything that would combust. The Henderson infant, born healthy in October, developed a cough that would not stop. The mother had no milk, her own body too depleted to produce what the baby needed. The doctor had no medicine that would help. The baby died on January 15th, 3 months old, and was buried beside Ezekiel Harrigan in the growing cemetery of snow graves behind the church. The Polk twins, aged 6, developed fevers that the doctor recognized as the early stages of pneumonia. Their parents burned their bed frame to keep the room warm, huddled with the children under every blanket they owned, and prayed prayers that went unanswered. Both children died within hours of each other on January 22nd. Reverend Josiah Whitmore stood in his church and delivered eulogies to smaller and smaller congregations as the winter claimed its victims. He spoke of God's mysterious ways and the need for faith in times of trial. He avoided mentioning the girl he had cast out for warning them this was coming. He did not acknowledge that every prediction she had made had come true with an accuracy that suggested knowledge far beyond human understanding. But privately in the cold hours of the night, he remembered. He remembered her standing in the general store, her young voice carrying absolute certainty. He remembered declaring her a liar and a tool of darkness. He remembered the town voting to exile her, sending her into the wilderness with nothing. And he wondered in the darkness of his unheated bedroom if perhaps the darkness had not been in the girl at all. By February, Coldwater was dying. 38 people had perished. The surviving population, reduced to 242 souls, faced supplies that would not last another month. The cattle industry that had been the foundation of their economy had ceased to exist, thousands of animals frozen in the coulees and draws where they had sought shelter from the endless wind. The men began to talk of searching for the girl. It was Thomas Mercer who finally spoke the words aloud during a council held in his family's house, the last building in town that still had enough fuel to heat a single room. He was 15 now, aged beyond his years by a winter that had taken his grandfather and two uncles. His father, Marcus Mercer, sat at the head of the table with shoulders bowed by loss and responsibility. The Blackwood child, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper, the one Reverend Whitmore sent away. She said she knew how to survive in the mountains. She said her father taught her. She was a liar. The response came from Marcus, but the words carried no conviction. Everything Sarah had predicted had manifested with brutal accuracy. If she survived, Thomas continued, she might know where to find food. She might have shelter. He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Might save us, he did not say. The people who sent her into the wilderness to die. The room fell silent. Outside wind rattled the windows and snow hissed against the walls. Someone's stomach growled audibly in the quiet. A child coughed, the wet sound suggesting fluid in the lungs. We don't know if she's alive, someone said. We don't know that she isn't, Thomas replied. And we know everyone here will be dead by April if nothing changes. More silence, heavier now, weighted with the truth none of them wanted to acknowledge. Finally, Marcus stood. I'll lead the search party. 5 men, the strongest horses we have left. We go north toward the foothills, where Caleb Blackwood used to trap. And if we find her dead, someone asked. Marcus looked at his son, saw in Thomas's eyes the same question that had haunted him since his father died. Was the girl right? Then we'll know, Marcus said simply, and we'll keep searching for anything that might help us survive. They departed on February 10th, 5 men on horses that were little more than walking skeletons. They carried what small amount of food could be spared bedrolls that provided inadequate protection against the cold and weapons that might or might not function after weeks of freezing temperatures. The town watched them leave with expressions that mixed hope and despair in equal measure. The journey that would have taken a day in summer required 3 days in winter. They followed creek beds and valleys where the snow was somewhat shallower, avoiding ridges where the wind had created drifts tall as houses. The horses floundered through powder that reached their chests, exhausting themselves after mere miles. The men took turns breaking trail on foot, each one working until exhaustion forced him to fall back and let another take the lead. They saw no game, no tracks, no signs of life beyond the occasional raven riding the wind currents above. The land had become a frozen desert, beautiful and lethal, indifferent to their suffering. On the evening of the second day, one of the horses went down. The animal simply stopped walking, stood trembling for a moment, then collapsed onto its side. No amount of urging could make it rise. They left it where it fell, knowing it would be dead within the hour, taking one more potential resource with it into oblivion. On the morning of the third day, they found the smoke. It rose in a thin, straight line from a cliff face they had passed a dozen times without noticing. So perfectly did the rock blend with the winter landscape. The smoke emerged from a crack in the stone above a natural overhang, climbing straight up in a column that spoke of a well-designed fire burning with good draft. Thomas saw it first. He pointed without speaking, and the other men turned to follow his gesture. For a long moment, they simply stared, afraid to hope, afraid to believe that the smoke meant what they desperately needed it to mean. They approached slowly, their horses picking careful paths through the drifted snow. The cliff face revealed itself, gradually red gold sandstone, layered and fractured, rising 40 feet above a small valley. And there, barely visible beneath the overhang, a dark gap in the rock. An entrance that had been shaped by human hands, fitted with a wooden door that seemed to have grown from the stone itself. Thomas dismounted and walked the final distance on foot. His breath emerged as ice crystals that caught the morning light. His hands shook, though whether from cold or emotion he could not say. He reached the door and stood before it, seeing now the craftsmanship in its construction, the careful fitting of logs, the precision of the frame carved into living rock. He raised one mittened hand and knocked. The sound seemed to echo inside, wood on wood, and then silence. For heartbeats that stretched into forever, nothing happened. Thomas felt despair rising in his chest. They had found the cave, but they had found it too late. The smoke meant nothing. It was the remnant of a fire that had outlived the girl who built it. Then the door opened. Sarah stood in the entrance, and Thomas felt his breath catch. She should have been dead. Every calculation, every probability, every reasonable expectation said that an 11-year-old girl could not survive what they had barely survived with houses and supplies and the resources of an entire town. Yet here she stood. She was thin, he saw, but not starving. Her face showed the burnish of wind and weather, but her eyes were clear and alert. She wore a coat stitched together from rabbit hides, and her hands bore calluses that spoke of labor no child should know. Behind her, through the opening, he glimpsed a space carved from stone, a fire burning in a pit, stacks of wood along the walls, in the shape of a horse in an adjoining chamber. She had built a home inside the mountain. She had survived what should have killed her, and now she stood before them, this child they had exiled, this prophet they had refused to hear, holding their lives in her small, scarred hands. "You came," Sarah said. The words held no surprise, no question, just a flat acknowledgement of something she seemed to have expected. Thomas found his voice, though it emerged rough and broken. "We came, we..." He stopped, unable to find words for what they had done, what they needed, what they were asking. Sarah's dark eyes moved past him to the other men, taking in their condition with the same observational skill that had allowed her to predict this winter. She saw their gauntness, their exhaustion, their desperation. And in her face, Thomas saw something that nearly broke him. Not satisfaction or vindication, but sadness. "The town is starving," she said, making a statement rather than asking a question. "Yes," Thomas forced the word out. "How many are left?" He did the calculation in his head, subtracting the deaths from the population he remembered. 242, mostly women and children now. The men, some of the men went out looking for food and didn't come back. Sarah was silent for the long moment, looking past the snow-covered valley toward the south where Coldwater lay dying. She was 11 years old, and the people who had called her a liar and cast her out were now dependent on her mercy. Thomas saw the calculation happening behind her eyes, saw her weighing something that no child should have to weigh. Finally, she spoke. "There is a valley 3 miles east of here. The elk winter there. My father showed me years ago. The snow is not as deep because of how the cliffs block the wind. If your hunters go there, they will find game." She paused, and Thomas held his breath. "And there are caves in these cliffs, not carved like mine, but natural, large enough to shelter families. I can show you where they are. The stone holds heat. People can survive there until spring if they are willing to work." Thomas stared at her, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. After everything they had done to her, she would help them. The question must have shown on his face because Sarah's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touching her lips. "My father taught me that the wilderness does not care about grudges. It only cares about who is prepared and who is not." She stepped back from the door, pulling it wider. "Come inside, warm yourselves. Then we have work to do." The 5 men crowded into Sarah's carved sanctuary, and Thomas watched their faces transform as they understood what she had accomplished. the fire burning in its stone pit, the smooth walls that spoke of weeks of patient labor, the organized storage alcoves holding supplies that represented the difference between life and death. And in the adjoining chamber, Whisper's dark eyes catching the firelight, the horse's presence explaining how this space maintained warmth that no fire alone could provide. Marcus Mercer removed his hat, and the gesture seemed less about courtesy than reverence. He was looking at survival distilled to its purest form, and the architect of that survival was a child his town had condemned to die. Sarah moved among them with practiced efficiency, ladling water from a hide bucket, offering strips of smoked meat that the men accepted with hands that trembled. Thomas took a piece and forced himself to chew slowly, despite the hunger clawing at his stomach. The meat was tough but flavorful, seasoned with herbs he could not identify. Real protein, the first he had tasted in weeks. "How long have you been here?" Marcus asked, his voice rough from cold and disuse. "Since the day you sent me away." Sarah spoke without inflection, stating fact rather than accusation. "I walked 2 days north and found this cliff. Started carving on September 30th. One of the other men, a rancher named Davies, whose wife had died in January, shook his head slowly. "You carved this, all of it." "The cavity was natural. I made it larger." Sarah gestured at the walls with a hand that bore scars Thomas had not noticed before, white lines crossing her palms where the knife had slipped or the stone had cut. "It took 6 weeks to make it livable. Then I expanded for Whisper." She spoke of the labor as if it had been ordinary work, no different than churning butter or mending fence. But Thomas looked at the smooth walls, the carved fire pit with its natural chimney, the door frame cut with precision into solid rock, and understood that what Sarah had accomplished represented a level of determination that bordered on supernatural. "The Elk Valley you mentioned," Marcus said, pulling the conversation back to immediate need. "Your certain game is there. My father took me there twice, once in winter. The valley runs east-west, sheltered on 3 sides by cliffs. The snow drifts against the north face, but the south slope stays clear enough for browse. The elk know it. They've wintered there for generations." 3 miles east. Marcus looked at his men, calculation visible in his expression. "We could reach it in a day, maybe less if the snow isn't too deep." "Take Whisper," Sarah said. The words dropped into the space like stones into still water. Thomas jerked his head up. "Your horse, she's strong. She can break trail better than your animals can." Sarah moved to the adjoining chamber, running a hand along Whisper's neck. The mare turned her head, pressing against Sarah's shoulder in a gesture of affection that made Thomas's chest tighten. "And you'll need her to pack out the meat." The silence that followed carried weight. Sarah was offering more than transportation. She was trusting them with the companion that had kept her sane through months of isolation, the living warmth that made her shelter survivable, the resource that might mean the difference between her own survival and death if the winter stretched longer than anticipated. "We'll bring her back," Marcus said, and something in his tone made it a vow rather than a promise. Sarah nodded once. "I know." They left an hour later after Sarah had shown them the route to the Elk Valley and described the landmarks they should watch for. Thomas turned in his saddle as they rode away, looking back at the cliff face that concealed Sarah's refuge. The smoke from her fire rose straight and true, a thin line against the pale sky. Then a ridge blocked his view, and she was gone. The Elk Valley revealed itself on the afternoon of the second day exactly where Sarah had said it would be. The cliffs rose on 3 sides, their faces streaked with ice, but their configuration creating a pocket of relative shelter. And on the south-facing slope, where wind and sun had combined to reduce the snow depth to perhaps 3 feet instead of 8 dark shapes moved against the white. Elk, dozens of them pawing through the snow to reach the grass and brush beneath. Cows and calves, mostly with a few young bulls whose antlers caught the light. They were thin, their ribs visible, even at a distance, but they were alive and they were food. The men approached downwind, moving slowly, using the terrain to mask their presence. They had brought rifles, though ammunition was precious, and they could not afford to waste shots. Marcus raised his weapon, first sighting on a cow that stood slightly apart from the main herd, and Thomas held his breath. The shot cracked across the valley, sharp and final. The cow dropped instantly dead before she hit the ground. The rest of the herd exploded into panicked flight, bounding through the deep snow with desperate energy, but not before Davies and another man named Carson had fired. Two more elk fell, three animals, hundreds of pounds of meat, enough to feed Coldwater for weeks if rationed properly, and proof that Sarah's knowledge could be trusted. They worked until darkness fell, field dressing the carcasses and loading the meat onto Whisper and the surviving horses. The mare accepted the weight without complaint, as if she understood the stakes. They made camp in the lee of the cliffs, burning sage and juniper that they gathered from wind-scoured slopes, and that night they ate fresh elk liver roasted over the coals. "She saved us," Davies said, staring into the fire. His voice carried the flatness of someone stating an obvious truth. "That child we threw away saved us." No one contradicted him. They reached Coldwater 3 days later, the horses laden with meat, and the town emerged from its houses like ghosts. Thin faces, hollow eyes, children who moved with the careful slowness of the very old. Thomas saw his mother and felt shock ripple through him at how much weight she had lost, how the skin stretched tight over her cheekbones. But they had brought food. Real food, not the leather and bark some families had been boiling for whatever nutrition it might yield. And they had brought something more important, hope and a name. Sarah Blackwood, the girl who had warned them. The girl who had survived. The girl who was willing to help despite every reason to let them die. That night, Marcus gathered the remaining town leadership in his house. Reverend Whitmore came moving slowly, his face gaunt, and his eyes holding something that might have been shame. The doctor attended along with the few other men who still had the strength to make decisions. Thomas stood in the corner listening. "The girl says there are caves," Marcus began without preamble. "Natural shelters large enough for families. She can show us where they are, and she says she can teach us to survive until spring." "We cannot move the entire town," someone objected. "Not in this weather. The children and the sick will die if we stay here." Marcus interrupted, his voice hard. "We have food for perhaps 3 more weeks, less if we share what we brought back. The fuel is gone. The houses are wheezing. We have 2 choices: evacuate to where we might survive, or stay here and count bodies until there are none left to count." Reverend Whitmore cleared his throat, and every eye turned to him. He had been silent since the search party returned, retreating to his church and his private thoughts. Now he stood, his tall frame bent by more than just age and hunger. "I was wrong," he said, the words emerging with difficulty, as if each one had to be forced past some internal barrier. "I called the child a liar when she spoke truth. I declared her corrupted by darkness when she tried to save us. I led this town in exiling an innocent, and 38 people have died because we would not listen." His voice broke on the number, 38, the count that would rise to 45 before the evacuation ended. "If Sarah Blackwood offers help, we accept it, and we do so knowing that we owe her a debt we can never repay." The vote was unanimous. They would evacuate. Sarah returned to Coldwater on February 20th, riding Whisper, at the head of a column that included Marcus Thomas and 6 other men who were strong enough to help with the evacuation. She had been gone from the town for nearly 5 months, and Thomas watched her face as they approached, looking for some reaction to the place that had rejected her. He saw none. Sarah's expression remained neutral, her dark eyes taking in the snow-choked streets and the smoke-damaged houses with the same calm observation she brought to everything. If returning stirred emotion, she gave no sign. The evacuation began the following morning. 242 people, most of them women and children, gathered in the center of town with whatever belongings they could carry. They had debated what to bring and what to leave, weighing survival needs against sentimental attachments. In the end, most chose blankets and clothing over photographs and heirlooms. The dead past mattered less than the uncertain future. Sarah moved among them, assessing their condition with eyes that had learned to see what others missed. She pulled aside to the families with the youngest children, the elderly, the sick, organizing them into a group that would move in the center of the column where they could be supported and protected. The stronger individuals she positioned at the front and rear, creating a formation that could respond if someone fell or needed help. Thomas found himself assigned to the rear guard, along with 5 other men whose job was to ensure no one fell behind. He watched Sarah give orders to people 3 and 4 times her age, and he watched them obey without question. She had earned authority through competence, and they recognized it even if they could not articulate why. They departed at dawn on February 22nd. The column stretched for perhaps a quarter-mile, a line of dark figures against the endless white. The pace was slow, determined by the weakest rather than the strongest. Children rode on makeshift sleds pulled by the few remaining horses. The elderly leaned on the arms of younger relatives. The sick were carried on stretchers fashioned from blankets and poles. Sarah led them north, following routes that minimized the snow depth and avoided the steepest climbs. She rode whisper at the front, occasionally dismounting to test the snow or check landmarks that were invisible to everyone else. Thomas noticed that she consulted no map, carried no compass, yet never hesitated about direction. The land spoke to her in a language the rest of them could not hear. The first day's travel covered perhaps 5 miles. They camped that night in a draw where the wind had scoured away some of the snow, revealing bare ground where they could build fires without the flames sinking into powder. Sarah showed them how to construct windbreaks from piled snow, how to position their bodies to conserve heat, how to melt snow for water without wasting fuel. A child cried in the darkness, a thin wail of misery that cut through the wind. Thomas heard Sarah's voice responding, quiet and steady, and the crying stopped. He wondered what she had said, what comfort an 11-year-old could offer when she herself had been abandoned and left to die. On the second day, a woman named Ellen Carson collapsed. She was perhaps 35, mother to 3 children, and she had been walking with a cough that rattled wetly in her chest. She simply stopped moving, swayed for a moment, then crumpled into the snow. The column halted. Sarah dismounted and knelt beside the woman, placing one hand on her forehead. Thomas saw the knowledge pass across Sarah's young face. Fever too high, breathing too labored, the kind of pneumonia that killed even with medical care. "Keep moving," Sarah said, rising. "Thomas Davies, make a stretcher. She rides from here." They fashioned a carrier from branches and blankets, loaded Ellen onto it, and continued. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling for her children, sometimes silent. They gave her water when she could swallow, covered her with extra blankets they could not spare, and hoped. She died that night quietly, sometime in the hours between midnight and dawn. Her children woke to find their mother cold and still, and their grief was a sound that haunted Thomas for the rest of his life. They buried her in snow because the ground was frozen too deep for digging. Sarah spoke words over the grave, simple things about courage and love, and the debts the living owed the dead. Then they moved on, because stopping meant dying, and Ellen Carson's sacrifice could not be allowed to mean nothing. 6 more people died during the journey. An elderly man whose heart simply gave out. 2 children who succumbed to fevers despite everything Sarah tried. A woman who had been starving herself to feed her family and whose body finally failed. 2 men who had hidden the severity of their injuries and who bled internally until their strength ran out. Each death diminished the column. Each grave marked in snow represented a failure that weighed on Sarah's young shoulders, though she gave no outward sign of the burden. She kept moving, kept leading, kept making decisions that gave the survivors their only chance. On the 5th day, they reached the caves. The cliff system Sarah brought them to stretched for nearly a mile, red sandstone riddled with openings that ranged from small alcoves to caverns large enough to hold 50 people. Sarah had mapped them during her months of isolation, exploring whenever the weather allowed, noting which had good drainage, which trapped smoke, which could be defended or sealed against weather. She assigned families to specific caves based on size and need. The Mercer family, being large, received one of the bigger caverns. The Henderson widow and her remaining children were placed in a smaller shelter near the Mercers, close enough for help if needed. The doctor received a cave with good light for treating the sick and injured. Sarah taught them everything. How to build fire pits that directed heat towards sleeping areas. How to construct doors from whatever materials they could scavenge, sealing entrances against drafts. how to position bodies during sleep to conserve warmth, how to ration supplies to make them last. She led hunting parties to the Elk Valley, showing the men how to approach game, where to shoot for clean kills, how to process carcasses to waste nothing. The valley yielded deer as well as elk and occasional grouse that could be snared in the thicker brush. It was not abundance, but it was enough. She organized foraging teams teaching women and older children how to dig for cattail roots, how to identify which tree barks were edible when stripped and boiled, how to find rose hips and juniper berries that still clung to frozen branches. Knowledge her father had passed to her now spread through the survivors' skills that had nearly died there, with Caleb Blackwood distributed to people who would carry them forward. By March, a routine had established itself. The caves remained cold, but they were survivable. The food supply remained marginal, but people were eating. Children still died, but fewer than before. The evacuation that had seemed like madness in February looked like salvation by the first thaw. Thomas worked alongside Sarah during those weeks, and he saw what the others did not. He saw the exhaustion she hid behind competence. He saw her hands shaking after days of guiding foraging parties through dangerous terrain. He saw her sit apart from the group at night, staring south toward the cave she had not visited since leading them away, and he understood that she had given up her sanctuary to save people who had given her nothing but exile. On March 15th, a warm wind blew down from the peaks, the first chinook of early spring. The temperature climbed above freezing for the first time in months. Icicles began to drip. The snow settled and compacted its surface, turning from crystalline white to granular gray. Winter's grip was loosening. Not broken, not yet, but it weakening. They would survive. But Reverend Josiah Whitmore would not be among the survivors. He had refused to evacuate. When the column left Coldwater in February, he had stood on the church steps and declared that he would not follow a child he had condemned, that God would provide for the righteous where the devil's servant could not. Marcus had argued, had begged, but Whitmore remained adamant. "I will pray for your souls," he had said as they departed, "and I will be here when you return, proof that faith suffices where fear leads astray." In April, when the snow had retreated enough to allow travel, a party returned to Coldwater to assess what could be salvaged. They found Reverend Whitmore in his church, frozen solid, kneeling before the altar with his hands clasped in prayer. The building around him showed signs of everything burnable having been fed to the stove pews, hymnals, even the wooden cross that had hung above the pulpit. He had died alone, sustained by faith that proved insufficient against 40 below zero, and his final prayer had frozen on his lips unanswered. They did not bury him. They closed the church door and left him where he had fallen, a monument to the cost of pride. The gathering came in May when the snow had finally retreated and the survivors returned to what remained of Coldwater. 235 people assembled in the open air, the church being too full of memories and death to enter. They stood in spring sunshine that felt like a miracle after the darkness they had endured, and they reckoned with what had happened. Thomas spoke first, though he was only 15 and had no official authority. But he had been part of the search party that found Sarah, and he had earned the right through months of hard work during the evacuation. His father stood beside him, nodding permission to speak. "We sent a child into the wilderness to die." Thomas's voice cracked, but he pushed through it. "We called her a liar when she told us the truth. We cast her out because she made us uncomfortable, because she knew things we didn't understand, because it was easier to blame her than to listen." He turned to where Sarah stood apart from the group, whispers reins in her hand, her carved sanctuary visible on the distant cliffs. The mare had survived the winter, along with the girl who had gentled her. Proof that preparation and knowledge could overcome what seemed impossible. Sarah Blackwood saved us. Every one of us standing here owes our life to a girl we treated as less than human. I don't know how to make that right. I don't know if it can be made right. But I know that we owe her more than words can say. Others spoke. Mothers whose children had survived because Sarah had shown them which plants could be eaten. Hunters who had found game where she had directed them. Families who had sheltered in caves she had mapped and prepared. One by one, they acknowledged the cruelty, the exile, the impossible forgiveness that had followed. Marcus Mercer stood and offered Sarah ownership of a third of his ranch, thousands of acres of prime grazing land that would make her wealthy beyond anything she could imagine. She refused quietly without explanation, simply shaking her head. Dr. Hayes offered to arrange adoption, to give her a home in his household, to ensure she never wanted for anything again. She refused that too. When the testimonies were finished, Sarah walked forward. She was still small, still young, still carrying that unsettling certainty in her eyes. But something had shifted. The adults no longer looked away when she met their gaze. They held it, seeing her clearly for the first time. My father told me once that the mountains do not judge. Her voice carried clearly in the spring air, audible to every person present. They do not care if you are rich or poor, good or wicked, young or old. They only care if you are prepared. She paused, looking at the faces arrayed before her. People who had survived because she chose mercy over vengeance. He said that people are different, that people judge and hate and fear what they do not understand. But he also said that people can learn, that they can change. Her gaze moved across the gathering, meeting eyes, acknowledging individuals. Thomas felt the weight of that look when it fell on him, felt the measure she was taking of his character and his future. I do not forgive what you did. Forgiveness is not something I know how to give, but I am glad you lived. I am glad the children lived. And if you want to learn what I know, how to read the land, how to prepare for what is coming, how to survive when the world turns cold, I will teach you. She paused again, and in that pause, Thomas heard the echo of everything that had happened, every death and every miracle distilled into a choice that would define what came next. My father said the mountains have no mercy, but we do not have to be like the mountains. We can choose to be different. The silence that followed was absolute. Then slowly people began to kneel, not in worship, but in acknowledgement. The gesture spread through the crowd like wind through grass until nearly everyone had dropped to one knee in the muddy earth, honoring the child who had saved them. Sarah did not kneel. She stood straight, her hand on Whisper's warm neck, and waited until they rose. Then she turned and began walking back toward her cliff sanctuary, toward the home she had carved from stone with nothing but a knife and determination and knowledge that had been passed from father to daughter in the wild places of the world. Thomas watched her go, and he understood that she would never truly return to live among them. She belonged to the mountains now, as much a part of the wilderness as the elk and the eagles. But she would teach. She would share what she knew. And perhaps that would be enough. Coldwater was rebuilt, though smaller and humbler than before. The community that rose from the ashes learned to watch the animals and heed their warnings. Sarah's cave became a place of learning. Children came first, then adults who swallowed their pride to learn from an 11-year-old how to read weather from caterpillar coats in beaver dams. The phrase, listening to the animals, entered the vocabulary of Wyoming rangelands, spoken with quiet respect by those who remembered the cost of refusing to hear. Sarah Blackwood lived in her cliff home until 1949, passing in winter at the age of 74. She had outlived everyone who cast her out. The knife her father had carried passed to her most dedicated student, Thomas Mercer's daughter, Sarah, who had spent 7 seasons learning from the woman she was named after. The cliff home still exists as a historical site maintained by descendants of those Sarah taught. Above the entrance, carved in letters Sarah added after the great winter visitors, read an inscription that captures everything. The mountains told me, I told you. Now we both know. Her father, Caleb, who had taught her to listen when no one else would have recognized the truth in every word.